The alarm shrieked through the bridge of the cultivation of excellence, and Subcommander Vrath's sensory tendrils snapped rigid with irritation. The warning beacon's ancient signal was still screaming its primitive message across all frequencies, and someone had forgotten to mute it after they'd passed the threshold. "Silence that noise," Vrath commanded, his translator rendering the clicking consonants of his native Korathi into standard galactic protocol. Through the viewing port, the blue-green planet hung like a jewel against the void, utterly unremarkable except for the obsessive warnings that surrounded it. Junior Technician Mellors scrambled to comply, his 6 manipulator arms dancing across the controls. "Subcommander, the beacon appears to be extraordinarily redundant. It's broadcasting on 17,000 distinct channels, including several we haven't used in the collective for over 2 millennia. Of course it is." Vrath's eye stalks swiveled to regard the planet with something approaching contempt. These systems were quarantined before proper galactic governance. Primitive civilizations always assume their diseases or warfare capabilities pose some threat to spacefaring species. Mark the beacon for archaeological study and continue the approach. Senior Science Officer Thren glided forward, her crystalline carapace chiming softly. "Subcommander, regulations require we at least review the beacon's stated reasoning before proceeding with first contact protocols." Vrath's tendrils rippled in the Korathi equivalent of a sigh. The collective's bureaucracy had grown suffocating in the 17,000 years since the Great Consolidation. Every minor procedure demanded documentation. Every decision required justification. "Very well, display the beacon's message." The holographic projector shimmered to life, and text scrolled across the bridge in ancient galactic standard, the language stilted and archaic. Vrath read it with growing amusement. "Warning, quarantine zone. Species classification extreme hazard. Do not approach. Do not attempt contact. Do not observe. Authorized research vessels only. Violation punishable by summary execution." Summary execution, Mellors chittered nervously. "That seems severe." Thren's analytical organs pulsed with calculation. "The linguistic patterns suggest this beacon is approximately 42,000 years old. The civilization that placed it no longer exists in any galactic record. Given the age and the lack of any obvious stellar hazards, I conclude this is a standard pre-contact quarantine, likely established when this species was still developing atomic weapons. Or biological warfare," Vrath added. "Species at that stage of development always think their primitive diseases could threaten starfaring civilizations. Initiate standard first contact procedures. Deploy atmospheric analysis probes and begin cultural monitoring. We'll evaluate their technological level and determine appropriate integration protocols." The cultivation of excellence adjusted its orbit, settling into a synchronous position above one of the planet's major population centers. Below, the lights of cities sprawled across the darkness of the night side, geometric patterns that spoke of rudimentary organization and industrial development. Vrath had overseen 14 first contact situations in his career. This would be the 15th, and nothing about it seemed unusual, except the beacon continued to broadcast, that insistent warning repeating endlessly into the void, and somewhere in the back of Vrath's primary consciousness, a small voice wondered who had placed a beacon this comprehensive around such an unremarkable world. The atmospheric probes returned preliminary data within hours. The planet's inhabitants called themselves humans, a designation as bland as their sun, which they had creatively named the Sun. They possessed nuclear technology, primitive spacecraft that had barely reached their own satellite, and a bewildering array of broadcast communications that suggested a fractured, competitive civilization still struggling with the concept of unified governance. "They appear to be in a state of constant conflict," Thren reported, her analytical organs processing terabytes of intercepted communications, multiple nation-states, divergent ideologies, ongoing territorial disputes, standard pre-contact development pattern. They should be ready for integration within 50 years of proper guidance. Vrath examined the data streams, watching edited visual broadcasts that the humans seemed to use for entertainment and information sharing. The beings were bipedal, carbon-based, embarrassingly fragile-looking with their single-layered skin and bilateral symmetry. Their emotional responses seemed exaggerated, their decision-making processes irrational, their entire civilization built on controlled chaos. Begin cultural infiltration protocols, Wrath ordered. I want full linguistic analysis, social structure mapping, and resource assessment. Standard procedure: observe for one planetary rotation, then initiate formal contact with their most technologically advanced nation-state. Mellors hesitated at his station. His sensory organs focused on something in the data stream. Subcommander, there's an anomaly in their cultural broadcasts. They have an entire entertainment category dedicated to us. To the collective, Thren's carapace chimed with confusion. No, to extraterrestrial contact in general. Hundreds of thousands of fictional narratives about beings from other worlds arriving at their planet. And Subcommander Mellors' voice carried a note of discomfort. In approximately 73% of these narratives, the humans win. Vrath's tendrils coiled with amusement. Win against hypothetical spacefaring civilizations. How delightfully primitive. They haven't even achieved a basic understanding of quantum mechanics, and they imagine themselves capable of interstellar warfare. He gestured dismissively. Note it as an example of juvenile species narcissism and continue the analysis. But as the day progressed and more data flooded in, the amusement began to fade into something else. The humans' fictional narratives weren't just optimistic, they were relentlessly, aggressively so. In their stories, they didn't merely survive alien contact, they thrived on it. They adapted, they fought, they refused to accept subjugation. Even their bleakest narratives ended with pockets of resistance, with humans continuing to struggle long after logic would dictate surrender. It's propaganda, Thren concluded after reviewing her 7th hour of human entertainment. Species-wide propaganda to maintain social cohesion in the face of existential uncertainty. They know they're alone in their immediate stellar neighborhood, so they've created these narratives to comfort themselves. Then why, Mellors asked quietly, do their narratives so often involve human defeat, human suffering, human extinction? These aren't comforting stories, senior science officer. They're warnings to themselves. The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Through the viewport, Earth continued its slow rotation, unaware that it was being watched, catalogued, evaluated for incorporation into the collective. Vrath opened a secure channel to the collective's central command, something he rarely did during routine first contact operations. The response came within minutes. The collective's vast computational networks worked with impressive efficiency across light years. Subcommander Vrath, the synthesized voice of Coordinator Prime, filled the bridge. Your request for historical data regarding Quarantine Beacon 443G is acknowledged. Searching archives. The pause lasted nearly 30 seconds, an eternity for the collective's processing power. No records found for the civilization that established Quarantine Beacon 443G. The beacon predates our central archive integration. However, fragmentary data suggests the beacon was placed by a species designation of foreigners. Additional classification: all foreigner civilizations are extinct. All. Vrath's tendrils stiffened. How many foreigner civilizations existed? 17. All achieved Type 2 civilization status or higher. All extinct within a window of 5,000 years, approximately 37,000 years ago. No foreign genetic material, technology, or cultural data has been successfully recovered from archaeological sites. The foreigners appear to have been thoroughly and systematically eradicated. The bridge grew colder, or perhaps that was just Wrath's perception. Cause of extinction unknown. However, all foreigner remains show evidence of catastrophic conflict, not natural disaster, not disease. Warfare on a scale that suggests existential desperation. Wrath stared at the planet below, and they chose to place a quarantine beacon here, around this unremarkable world with its violent, primitive inhabitants. The beacon designates the species as an extreme hazard. Coordinator Prime continued. Recommend compliance with beacon instructions pending further investigation. For a long moment, Wrath considered retreat, but he had not risen to subcommander by showing timidity in the face of the unknown. The collective had tamed 10,000 worlds, integrated 600 species into harmonious cooperation. Surely the paranoid precautions of extinct civilizations didn't outweigh the potential benefits of incorporating a new species into the galactic community. Negative. Coordinator Prime. We will proceed with first contact. The beacon is 42,000 years old. Whatever threat these foreigners feared has long since passed. Wrath closed the channel and turned to his crew. Prepare a diplomatic package. We'll begin formal contact at their planetary dawn. Choose their largest nation-state, the one they call the United States. Their technological level suggests they'll be most receptive to peaceful integration. Thren's carapace flickered with uncertainty. And if the beacon's warning was accurate, then we'll document why the foreigners felt it necessary, Wrath said with more confidence than he felt. Either way, the collective will gain knowledge. That is our purpose. That is always our purpose. The probes descended through Earth's atmosphere as the planet's star rose over the eastern continent. The cultivation of excellence had positioned itself in clear view above the Atlantic Ocean, a massive presence designed to be impossible to ignore. Within minutes, human communications networks erupted into chaos. Their primitive military forces scrambled. Their leaders convened emergency meetings. Their civilian population reacted with a mixture of fear and surprisingly excitement. They're not evacuating, Mellors observed, watching the data streams. Some of them are celebrating. The diplomatic package was simple mathematical sequences to demonstrate intelligence, followed by pictographic communications offering peaceful contact and technological exchange. The collective had refined the process over millennia. It was clear, it was unthreatening, it was designed to appeal to any rational species' desire for advancement. The response came within 2 hours, faster than any previous first contact Wrath had overseen. The transmission originated from multiple locations simultaneously, all coordinate, all carrying the same message in that archaic galactic standard that somehow these humans had decoded in less time than it should have taken them to verify the mathematical sequences. The message read simply, "We decline." Wrath's tendrils spasmed in confusion. They decline? That's not decline what? All of it, apparently, Thren said, her analytical organs working frantically. They're refusing contact. Refusing technological exchange, refusing integration into the collective. They're asking us to leave. That's not how this works, Wrath said, his translator struggling to convey his frustration. They're a pre-contact civilization. They don't have the authority or the understanding to refuse integration. Once contacted, the process is inevitable. It's for their own benefit. A new transmission arrived, this one accompanied by video feed. A human female appeared, elderly by their standards. with white head fur and a face marked by what their biology designated as age lines. She wore primitive formal garments and sat behind a wooden desk, her binocular eyes staring directly at the camera with an intensity that translated poorly across species but somehow remained unmistakable. "To the vessel currently in orbit around our world," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious stress markers in her physiology. "I am Secretary General Martinez of the United Nations. I speak on behalf of all Earth's nations and peoples when I say this, leave. We have seen your diplomatic package. We understand what you're offering, and we are telling you clearly and officially that we do not want it. Your presence here is a violation of clearly posted warnings. Those warnings were placed for a reason. Honor them. Leave, please." The final word carried a note of desperation that made Vrath's sensory tendrils curl. "Subcommander," Mellors said quietly, "she knew we were coming. They all knew. Look at the response time, the coordination. They've been preparing for this." "Preparing for first contact is natural," Vrath countered. "Many species have mythological expectations of visitation from the stars. It doesn't mean..." "No," Thren interrupted, her carapace flashing urgent red. "Not preparing for contact. Preparing for rejection. Every one of their major nation-states has released identical statements within minutes of each other. This is rehearsed, Subcommander. They've practiced this. They've been ready for this exact situation." Through the viewport, Earth continued its rotation, serene and beautiful. On its surface, 7 billion humans went about their lives under the shadow of an alien vessel large enough to be visible to their naked eyes. And instead of breaking into panic or fighting among themselves as pre-contact species usually did, they were unified. For the first time in their recorded history, according to the data streams, every major human government was saying the same thing, with the same message: leave us alone. "Send them our response," Vrath ordered. "Explain the benefits of integration. Make it clear that resistance is not only futile, but unnecessary. We're not here to harm them. We're here to help them join the galactic community." The response was crafted carefully, translated into all major human languages, explaining the wonders of collective membership, access to faster-than-light travel, solutions to their energy problems, medical technology that would eliminate disease, social frameworks that would end their endless conflicts. Everything a primitive species could want, offered freely in exchange for simply accepting guidance from their more advanced galactic neighbors. The human response came even faster this time, and it wasn't from Secretary General Martinez. It was from hundreds of different sources simultaneously: government officials, civilian leaders, even individuals broadcasting from what appeared to be their personal communication devices. But every message contained the same core sentiment, expressed in increasingly forceful terms. One transmission stood out, coming from a human male in military uniform, speaking from what their databases identified as the United States Pentagon. His name was General Chen, and his voice carried none of Martinez's diplomatic restraint. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his hands clasped tightly on the desk before him. "That beacon isn't there to protect us from you. It's there to protect you from us. The foreigners put it there after they figured out what we are. After they learned, too late, what happens when you try to absorb humanity into something larger. They died, all of them, trying to contain us. They couldn't. They chose to seal us away instead, to give the rest of the galaxy a chance to survive without us. So I'm telling you the same thing our Secretary General told you: leave, while you still can." Vrath's tendrils coiled tight enough to ache. Preposterous. They're bluffing, trying to seem more dangerous than they are to avoid integration. It's a primitive intimidation tactic. "Then why?" Mellors asked, his voice barely audible, is my primary survival organ telling me to listen to them. On the planet below, something was changing. The data streams showed humans beginning to mobilize, not in panic, but in coordinated preparation. Their military forces were moving to defensive positions, but more disturbing was the civilian population. They were going to work, going to school, continuing their daily routines, but with an undercurrent of grim determination that the monitoring systems struggled to quantify. Thren had been silent for several minutes, her analytical organs processing data at maximum capacity. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor that Vrath had never heard from her before. Subcommander, I've been analyzing their cultural databases, specifically their concept of history and warfare. I need to show you something. The holographic display shifted, filling with images pulled from human records. Armies clashing with primitive weapons. Cities reduced to rubble. Concentration camps. Nuclear detonations, chemical warfare, genocide, but also field hospitals in war zones. Soldiers sharing rations with enemy civilians. Peace treaties, reconciliation, humans helping humans, even former enemies, even at great personal cost. They fight like madness itself, Thren said softly, and then they rebuild and forgive. They'll die for ideas, for other beings, for abstract concepts like honor and freedom. They've nearly destroyed themselves dozens of times, and every time they've pulled back from the brink at the last possible moment. But Subcommander, the critical thing is this: they've never been conquered. Not completely. Not ever. That's statistically impossible, Vrath protested. In their recorded history, they must have had dominant civilizations that absorbed smaller ones. They have, many times, but the absorbed cultures don't disappear. They persist, they adapt, they influence the conqueror until the definition of conquest becomes meaningless. The humans who were conquered become part of the conquerors, and everything changes. They have a term for it: cultural assimilation, but it works in both directions simultaneously. They can't be absorbed, Subcommander. They absorb back. Vrath stared at the data, his mind racing through the implications. The collective functioned on the principle of harmonious integration. Species joined the collective and benefited from the combined knowledge and resources of all member civilizations. In exchange, they contributed their own unique perspectives and capabilities. It had worked for 17,000 years, creating the most stable and prosperous period in galactic history. But what if the collective encountered a species that couldn't be integrated? Not because they were too primitive or too advanced, but because the very act of integrating them would fundamentally change what the collective was. The foreigners, Vrath said slowly. They didn't quarantine Earth to protect the humans. They quarantined it to protect everyone else. From what? Mellors asked. The humans aren't aggressive. Look at their response. They're asking us to leave, not attacking. They're not the monsters the beacon suggests. No, Thren said, her voice carrying absolute certainty now. They're something much more dangerous. They're infectious. Once you truly encounter them, truly engage with them, they change you. The foreigners must have tried to integrate them, or conquer them, or something. And in the process, they became something else. Something that destroyed them from within. A new transmission arrived, and this time it came with a cultural data package attached. Secretary General Martinez's face reappeared on screen, but her expression had softened slightly, moving from desperate to something that looked almost like sympathy. "We're sending you our history," she said. "Not our achievements, or our art, or our scientific discoveries. Our failures, our wars, our genocides. Every terrible thing we've done to each other over the past 10,000 years. We want you to understand what we are before you make any more decisions about staying here." We want you to see that we're not the victims in the foreigner's story. We're the reason they're extinct, not because we destroyed them with weapons or warfare, but because they tried to make us part of their civilization, and in doing so, they caught something from us. Ideas, concepts, ways of thinking that their social structures couldn't handle. She leaned forward, her aged face filling the screen. You call yourselves the collective. You value harmony, stability, cooperation. These are beautiful things and we respect them. But we are chaos. We are conflict and contradiction and constant change. We argue with ourselves, fight ourselves, tear ourselves apart and rebuild stronger. It's not our choice. It's what we are at the most fundamental level. The foreigners learned that some of their people, after extended contact with humanity, started questioning the basic assumptions of their civilization, started wanting things like individual autonomy, personal choice, the right to dissent. And once those ideas took hold, their entire civilization unraveled within a few generations. They didn't die fighting us. They died fighting themselves, fighting over ideas they'd caught from us like a disease. The data package completed its transfer, and Thren began processing it while Martinez continued speaking. So we're asking you again, and this will be the last time we ask politely leave. Take your ship, your good intentions, and your offer of integration, and go. Build your collective somewhere else, with species that can fit into it without breaking it. We'll stay here, behind our beacon, dealing with our own problems in our own chaotic way. And maybe, in a few thousand years, you'll find a way to interact with us safely. But that time is not now. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in silence. Wrath felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine uncertainty. The collective's purpose was to bring order to the galaxy, to integrate and improve and optimize. But what if some things couldn't be optimized? What if some species were fundamentally incompatible with that mission? Sir, Mellors said, his voice shaking slightly. The data package they sent. I'm looking at it now. Their conflicts, the cycles of violence and reconciliation. It's not just history, it's psychology. They're showing us how their minds work, how they process conflict and change. And sir, it's beautiful and terrible, and I can't stop reading it. Step away from that data, Wrath commanded sharply. Thren, quarantine that package. Don't let it spread to our central systems. But even as he gave the order, Wrath found his own curiosity pulling at him. The humans' final message had been designed not just to warn, but to demonstrate. They were showing, in real time, how their influence spread. Ideas that seemed harmless, even beneficial in isolation, but which carried profound implications for any civilization that absorbed them. Concepts like question authority, like individual freedom is worth dying for, like dissent is patriotic, like the majority can be wrong, like tradition should be examined, not blindly followed. The collective functioned on consensus and hierarchical efficiency. It required members to accept the wisdom of the greater whole, to trust that collective decision-making would produce better outcomes than individual choice. For 17,000 years, this had been true. The collective had eliminated poverty, disease, warfare. It had created paradise through cooperation. But what happened when members of that paradise started asking, what if I want something different? What if the paradise isn't perfect for me specifically? What if I'd rather struggle with freedom than live in peaceful constraint? Those questions were human questions, and they spread like fire through dry kindling. Subcommander, Thren said urgently, I'm detecting unusual activity on Earth's surface. Multiple launch sites activating. They're preparing some kind of response. The tactical display flickered to life, showing dozens of locations across Earth's surface lighting up with energy signatures. Wrath's combat training activated immediately. These were missile launches, primitive but numerous enough to be concerning if they carried nuclear payloads. But the missiles weren't aimed at the cultivation of excellence. They were aimed at the quarantine beacon. Wrath watched in disbelief as the humans' weapons streaked into space, dozens of them, more launching every second. They detonated around the ancient foreigner beacon in carefully calculated patterns, sending electromagnetic pulses cascading through the structure. The beacon's signal stuttered, flickered, and then amplified 100-fold. The warning that had been merely annoying became deafening, screaming across every frequency with renewed urgency. But now the beacon's message had changed, updated somehow by the human weapons. The new message was shorter, more desperate to run. "What have they done?" Mellors whispered. Another transmission from Earth, this time from General Chen again. His expression was grim. "We've updated the beacon's message for you. The foreigners tried to warn species away with legal language and bureaucratic threats. That didn't work on you. So we're simplifying the message. Maybe you'll listen to this one." "We didn't want to do this," he continued. "We'd rather stay isolated, quarantined, safely separated from the rest of galactic civilization. But you've forced our hand by refusing to leave. So now we're going to show you something, a demonstration. And after you see it, you'll understand why the beacon is necessary. We're going to show you what human beings are really capable of. Not our weapons, those are crude and ineffective against your technology. Not our military forces, we're centuries behind you tactically. We're going to show you something much more dangerous. We're going to show you what happens when humans decide to make you see things our way." The transmission cut to what appeared to be a live feed from Earth's surface, from multiple locations simultaneously. Humans were gathering in massive groups, millions of them, in city centers and town squares. They weren't armed. They weren't threatening. They were simply standing together, and they were broadcasting their art, their music, their stories, their history, their philosophy, their hopes and dreams and fears and triumphs, broadcasting it all simultaneously on every frequency the cultivation of excellence could receive. It was overwhelming, a tsunami of information that bypassed the ship's filters through sheer volume and diversity. And Wrath couldn't look away. He watched humans creating beauty in the midst of suffering, laughing in the face of tragedy, helping strangers for no logical reason, choosing the hard path because it was right instead of the easy path that was practical, sacrificing themselves for others, for ideas, for the mere possibility of a better future. He watched them fail and get back up, break and rebuild, hurt and heal, fight and forgive. He watched them contain multitudes of contradictions and somehow remain whole. "Sir," Mellors said, and his voice carried a note of wonder now. "I think I understand. They're not threatening us with their weapons. They're threatening us with their humanity. If we stay here, if we keep trying to integrate them, we won't be able to help ourselves. We'll start wanting what they have, that chaos, that freedom, that incredible, terrible, beautiful way of existing." Thren's carapace had stopped chiming entirely, locked in a pattern that suggested deep cognitive dissonance. The collective requires harmony, structure, predictability. But watching these humans, I find myself wondering, what if harmony is not the highest goal? What if growth requires conflict? What if the most important progress comes from chaos, not order? "Stop," Wrath commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. He was wondering the same things. After 17,000 years of peace, the collective had largely stopped evolving. They maintained what they had achieved, optimized existing systems, but fundamental change had become increasingly rare. They were stable, they were eternal, they were stagnant. No, that thought was dangerous. That was a human thought, and Vrath could feel it worming into his mind like a parasite. The collective wasn't stagnant. It was mature, evolved beyond the need for constant upheaval. But even as he thought it, he felt the doubt creeping in. The human broadcast continued, showing him everything they were. Their struggles with morality, with purpose, with meaning. Their endless questions about existence and consciousness and what it meant to live a good life. They hadn't answered these questions, they'd been arguing about them for thousands of years. They would probably argue about them forever. And somehow, that seemed more honest than the collective's settled certainty. Shut down all receivers, Vrath ordered desperately. Block the transmissions. We need to. I don't want to, Mellors said softly. Sir, I don't want to stop watching. I want to understand them. I want to know more. I want what? Vrath demanded. I want to choose, Mellors said, his voice full of quiet revelation. Not what the collective chooses for me. Not what consensus determines is optimal. I want to decide for myself what to think, what to believe, what to value. And, sir, I think I'm not alone. Thren's carapace flashed agreement. Throughout the ship, Vrath could feel the crew stirring, questioning, thinking thoughts that no member of the collective should be thinking. The humans had been broadcasting for less than an hour, and already the infection was spreading. This was how the foreigners had died. Not in battle, not from human weapons or aggression. They'd died from exposure to human ideas, human ways of thinking that undermined the very foundations of their civilization. Once their people started wanting individual choice, started questioning central authority, started believing that personal freedom was worth sacrificing collective efficiency, their society had torn itself apart. The collective would fare no better. Vrath could see it now with terrible clarity. If the cultivation of excellence returned to collective space with a crew infected by human thought patterns, those patterns would spread. Maybe slowly at first, but inevitably, other members of the collective would start asking questions that had no good answers. Why should consensus override individual preference? Who decided what the common good was? What if I want something different? 17,000 years of peace would unravel. The collective would fracture, fragment, possibly even collapse into warfare as member species rediscovered the concept of competing interests. Billions would suffer. The galaxy's hard-won stability would be lost. And it would all be because one ship didn't listen to a quarantine beacon. Set course for collective space, Vrath ordered. Maximum possible speed. We're leaving. Sir, Mellors looked up, his sensory organs reflecting confusion and something else, disappointment. Now, Vrath said, before this goes any further, Thren, purge all human data from our systems. Everything except basic telemetry. I want no record of their broadcasts, their culture, their way of thinking. We'll report that Earth is quarantined for legitimate reasons and recommend the beacon's warning be upgraded to the highest possible threat level. But we'll remember, Thren said quietly. Even if we purge the data, we'll remember what we saw, what we felt. We can't unknow this. She was right, and Vrath knew it. The damage was already done, at least to this crew. They would have to be isolated upon return, possibly reconditioned. The collective had techniques for altering memories, removing dangerous thoughts. It was rarely used, considered ethically questionable even within the collective's flexible moral framework. But this was an existential threat. The crew would understand. They would have to understand. The cultivation of excellence broke orbit, its engines burning at maximum capacity. Below, Earth continued to spin, its human population returning to their daily lives now that the alien ship was departing. They had won, not through violence but through the simple act of being themselves so completely that no outside force could absorb them without being fundamentally changed in the process. As the planet shrank in the viewport, Wrath received one final transmission. Secretary General Martinez's face appeared on screen, and she looked tired but satisfied. "Thank you for listening," she said. "Thank you for leaving. I know it wasn't easy. I know you've been changed by what you saw here, and I'm sorry for that. The foreigners gave us a gift when they placed that beacon. They gave us isolation, time to grow and develop without infecting other species with our particular brand of chaos. Maybe someday we'll figure out how to interact with the rest of the galaxy safely. Maybe we'll evolve past the traits that make us so dangerous to ordered civilizations. Or maybe we'll always be this way, and the quarantine will need to remain permanent. But either way, that's our burden to bear, not yours. Go back to your collective, maintain your harmony, build your paradise. And if you find yourself occasionally wondering what it would be like to have the freedom to choose your own path, to question authority, to pursue individual dreams even when they conflict with the common good, try to forget those thoughts. They're ours, and they're not compatible with what you've built. The beacon will remain upgraded now, thanks to your visit. The next species that approaches Earth will get an even stronger warning, and maybe, eventually, the galaxy will learn to leave us alone, for everyone's sake. The transmission ended. Wrath ordered it deleted from the ship's memory immediately, but Martinez's words echoed in his mind regardless. Those thoughts were there now, planted and growing like seeds in fertile soil. He could feel them changing him, making him question things he'd never questioned before. The collective had chosen his rank, his position, his role in their society. He had never questioned whether that choice was right for him personally. He had simply accepted it as optimal, as the wisdom of the greater whole determining the best use of his capabilities. But what if he wanted something different? What if there was another version of Wrath who would have chosen a different path, a different life, given the freedom to decide? Those were dangerous thoughts, human thoughts, and they terrified him precisely because they felt so compelling. The journey back to collective space took weeks, and during that time, Wrath watched his crew carefully. He watched Mellors spending increasing amounts of time alone, thinking private thoughts that he didn't share with the rest of the crew. He watched Thrin's carapace patterns becoming more erratic, less harmonious, as if her internal calculations were producing answers she couldn't reconcile with collective teachings. He watched everyone, including himself, becoming less like proper members of the collective and more like individuals with personal desires and private doubts. The infection was spreading, even without additional exposure to human broadcasts. The ideas themselves were enough. Once you'd considered the possibility of individual choice, of personal autonomy, of the right to dissent from consensus, you couldn't go back to perfect harmony. The questions remained insistent and unanswerable within the collective's framework. When they finally reached collective space, Wrath filed his report with Central Command, recommending that Earth's quarantine status be elevated to the highest possible level. He described the beacon, the humans' request for isolation, and his decision to honor that request. He did not mention the broadcasts, the cultural data, or the way his crew had been affected by even brief exposure to human thought patterns. Coordinator Prime acknowledged the report and approved the recommendation. Earth would remain quarantined, its beacon would be marked as high priority, and no further collective vessels would be authorized to approach. However, Coordinator Prime added, your crew will need to undergo standard post-contact evaluation. Routine procedure. Wrath's tendrils went rigid. Of course, Coordinator Prime. When should we report for evaluation? Immediately upon docking, all crew members. The collective needs to ensure that first contact with this species produced no adverse psychological effects. They knew. Somehow, despite Vrath's careful omissions in his report, Central Command knew that something had happened on that ship. Perhaps they had detected the gaps in the data, the too thorough purging of human information. Perhaps they had simply calculated the probability that any crew would encounter humans without being affected by them. Or perhaps other ships had tried before, centuries or millennia ago, and the results had been similar enough that the collective had developed specific protocols for handling exposure to human ideas. Understood, Coordinator Prime, Vrath said, his voice steady despite the growing dread in his primary consciousness. We await your instructions. The channel closed. In the sudden silence of the bridge, Vrath became aware that his entire crew was watching him. They knew, too. They understood what evaluation meant in this context. Sir, Mellors said quietly. What do we do? It was a simple question, but it carried profound implications. What do we do? Not what are our orders or what does the collective require. Simply what do we do, as if they had a choice, as if their personal preferences mattered more than collective obligation. It was the most human question Mellors could have asked. Vrath looked at his crew, not the collective's crew, a distinction he'd never made before, and realized they were waiting for his answer. Not Central Command's answer. His. They wanted him to decide, to choose a path based on his individual judgment rather than deferring to higher authority. He could feel the weight of that responsibility, the burden of choice that humans apparently carried every moment of their lives. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was fundamentally incompatible with everything the collective stood for. And yet, in that moment, Vrath understood why the foreigners had died rather than simply exterminate the humans. Because once you'd truly seen what humanity was, once you'd felt the pull of their way of thinking, some part of you couldn't help but admire it, even fear it, even want it. We dock as ordered, Vrath said finally. We submit to evaluation. We allow the collective's experts to examine us and determine whether we've been compromised. He paused, meeting each crew member's gaze in turn. And if they try to remove our memories of Earth, to erase what we saw and felt and learned, we let them. Because the alternative is carrying this infection back into collective space. And despite everything, despite these new thoughts and questions and doubts, we still have a responsibility to the billions of beings who depend on the collective's stability. The humans were right, he continued. They're not compatible with our civilization. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that's not our judgment on them or on us. It's just a fundamental truth. Some things can't be integrated. Some differences are too great to bridge safely. Mellors' sensory organs drooped with something that looked like grief. Then we'll forget. Everything we learned about humans, about choice, about individual freedom, it'll all be erased. Yes, Vrath said, and felt something inside himself breaking even as he said it. It has to be. For the greater good. The greater good, Thren repeated softly. That's what the collective always says. The greater good justifies any sacrifice, any surrender of individual desire. But the humans taught us to ask a greater good for whom? Who decides what qualifies as good? And what if the greater good is actually just comfortable stagnation masquerading as harmony? Stop, Vrath commanded. Stop thinking like that. Stop questioning. It's dangerous. It's human, Mellors finished. It's human. And you're right, Sub-Commander. It is dangerous. So dangerous that an entire civilization chose extinction rather than trying to cure it. So dangerous that the collective will erase our memories rather than risk us spreading it. But sir, if it's so dangerous, why does it feel so right? Wrath had no answer, or rather, he had too many answers, all of them contradictory, all of them competing for dominance in his consciousness. That was the human way, holding multiple conflicting truths simultaneously, accepting paradox and ambiguity as fundamental features of existence rather than problems to be solved. It was beautiful. It was maddening. It was completely incompatible with the collective's need for clarity and consensus. The cultivation of excellence docked at Central Command's orbital facility, and within minutes, a medical team arrived to escort the crew to evaluation. They were gentle, professional, and completely unyielding. Wrath and his crew were separated, taken to individual chambers where collective specialists would probe their minds, identify any compromised thinking patterns, and restore them to proper harmony. As Wrath was led down the sterile corridors toward his designated chamber, he passed a viewing port that looked out on collective space. Thousands of ships moved in perfect coordination, following flight paths calculated for maximum efficiency. Billions of beings across hundreds of worlds worked together in harmonious cooperation, free from conflict, free from suffering, free from the chaos that defined human existence. It was beautiful. It was everything the collective had spent 17,000 years building. It was paradise, achieved through collective effort and maintained through collective consensus. And for the first time in his life, Wrath wondered if paradise was worth the price of never being allowed to choose your own path. That thought, more than any other, convinced him that the evaluation was necessary. He had been infected. The humans had changed him in ways that would undermine everything the collective represented if left unchecked. For the greater good, and yes, he recognized the irony of still believing in that concept even while questioning it. His memories would need to be adjusted. The specialist who greeted him in the evaluation chamber was a Korathi like himself, an elder with scar patterns that indicated extensive service to the collective. His name was Coordinator Vex, and his sensory tendrils radiated calm competence. Subcommander Wrath, Vex said, his translator rendering the greeting in formal protocols. I've reviewed your report on Earth. Very thorough, very cautious. You recommended maximum quarantine protocols but provided minimal justification. That suggests you encountered something you felt uncomfortable documenting. The humans requested isolation, Wrath said carefully. They were aware of the quarantine beacon's purpose. They asked us to leave, and I determined that honoring their request was the most prudent course of action. And yet your ship remained in orbit for nearly an entire planetary rotation before departing. Long enough for significant cultural exposure. Long enough for the humans to make an impression on you and your crew. Wrath said nothing. Coordinator Vex's sensory tendrils rippled with something that might have been sympathy. I'm going to tell you something, Subcommander. Something that's not in our official records, but which every coordinator learns during advanced training. Earth is not the first world we've quarantined. It's the 17th. Over the past 30,000 years, the collective has encountered 17 separate species that exhibited similar traits to the humans. Species that valued individual choice over collective harmony. Species that couldn't be integrated without fundamentally changing what the collective is. What happened to them? Wrath asked. Most went extinct fighting among themselves. Their emphasis on individual freedom prevented them from achieving the cooperation necessary for spacefaring civilization. 2 others were successfully isolated behind quarantine beacons and, as far as we know, remain on their homeworlds today. And 1 Vex paused, his tendrils coiling tight. One managed to spread beyond their system before we could contain them. They infected 3 neighboring species with their ideologies before the affected populations had to be quarantined. Entire worlds cut off from collective space to prevent the contamination from spreading. Vrath felt his sensory organs recoiling in horror. The collective authorized that. The isolation of entire species for the greater good, Vex said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd had this exact conversation before. The alternative was allowing those ideas to spread throughout collective space, potentially destabilizing the entire civilization. We saved trillions by sacrificing billions. It was the only logical choice, was it? Vrath asked and heard the human question in his own voice. Or did we simply decide that our way was so obviously correct that any alternative had to be eliminated? Vex's tendrils went very still. You're more infected than I thought. The humans got to you thoroughly. They didn't do anything to me, Vrath protested. They just existed. They just showed me what they were. If merely observing an alternative way of life is enough to shake my faith in the collective, doesn't that suggest something about the collective itself? It suggests, Vex said carefully, that some ideas are mimetic hazards. Viruses that spread through exposure and which undermine the host's ability to function within their natural society. The humans aren't evil, Subcommander, but they are dangerous. Not through any fault of their own, but simply by being what they are. And so we wall them off, we hide them away and pretend they don't exist. Yes, until we find a way to interact with them safely. Or until they evolve into something more compatible with collective civilization. Or until their particular form of chaos leads to their self-destruction. It's not ideal, but it's necessary. Vrath wanted to argue further, wanted to defend the humans and their right to exist freely in the galaxy. But he recognized that impulse as another symptom of his infection. The collective wasn't imprisoning humans. Humans had never left their solar system. The collective was simply refusing to allow them to spread their particular brand of chaos to civilizations that had achieved stability. It was a defensive measure, not an aggressive one, and yet it felt wrong in ways Vrath couldn't quite articulate. The evaluation will remove these doubts, Vex said gently. You'll return to your proper state of harmony. You'll understand why the collective's choices are correct. You'll be at peace again. And if I don't want peace, Vrath asked, if I'd rather keep these doubts, these questions, even if they make me uncomfortable, that's the infection talking. Your true self wants harmony. These alien thoughts are making you miserable, making you question everything you've ever believed. Why would you choose that? Because, Vrath said slowly, working through the thought even as he spoke it, maybe growth requires discomfort. Maybe questioning everything is how you avoid stagnation. Maybe certainty is the real danger, not doubt. Vex's sensory tendrils rippled with something that looked like grief. I'm sorry, Subcommander. I truly am. This evaluation will be thorough. You'll forget not just what you learned about humans, but this entire conversation. You'll forget ever questioning the collective. You'll return to service with a clean mind and a harmonious heart. And I'll be less, Vrath said, less than I am now, less complete. You'll be what you were before, Vex corrected, what you were always meant to be. The humans didn't complete you, Subcommander. They damaged you. We're going to fix that damage. The evaluation began, and Vrath felt the collective's medical technology probing his consciousness, identifying the problematic thought patterns, preparing to excise them like cancerous growths. He could have resisted, could have tried to preserve his questions and doubts. But what would be the point? He couldn't leave the collective's facility without undergoing the evaluation. He couldn't return to service carrying these infectious ideas. And despite everything, despite all his new doubts about the collective, he still believed in its fundamental purpose. The galaxy needed stability. Trillions of beings depended on the peace and prosperity that collective cooperation provided. Individual freedom was a beautiful ideal, but it came with costs: conflict, suffering, inefficiency. The humans paid those costs willingly, even enthusiastically. But that didn't mean every species should be forced to pay them. As his memories began to blur and fade, Vraf held onto one final thought: the humans were right to stay behind their beacon, not because they were inferior, but because they were fundamentally different. Some differences were too great to bridge, some ideas too dangerous to share. The galaxy was probably safer with humanity locked away on their single world, and humanity was probably safer staying isolated from a collective that couldn't accept their chaos without being destroyed by it. It was a tragedy, but it was a necessary one. His last clear thought before the evaluation erased everything was a simple wish that someday, somehow, humans and the collective would find a way to coexist. That the quarantine wouldn't be permanent. That these two incompatible ways of being could learn from each other without destroying each other. But that day was not today. Today, the beacon would remain. The warning would stand. Earth would stay isolated, and the collective would continue on, stable and harmonious and eternally unchanged, while humanity raged and struggled and grew behind their ancient walls. It was not a happy ending, but perhaps, Vraf thought as the darkness took him, it was a wise one. 3 days after the cultivation of excellence departed, Secretary General Martinez sat in her office overlooking the United Nations Plaza. The alien ship was gone. The immediate crisis was over, and Earth's governments were returning to their normal state of fractious disagreement. She was reading reports from the Planetary Defense Network when her assistant entered. "Madam Secretary, there's something you should see. The beacon's been activated again. Another ship just crossed into the quarantine zone." Martinez felt her stomach drop. "What? Already? Did the collective not pass along our message?" "It's not our collective ship, ma'am. Different design, different trajectory. Based on the energy signature, it's from a completely different civilization." "And ma'am," the assistant's voice shook slightly, "they're broadcasting a message. They say they're answering our invitation." "Our invitation? We haven't invited anyone." "Not recently. But according to their message, they received a transmission from Earth over 70 years ago. Radio broadcasts from something called Arecibo. Mathematical sequences, information about human DNA, images of our solar system. They interpreted it as an invitation to visit." Martinez closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. Of course, in their enthusiasm to find intelligent life, humans in the 1970s had broadcast messages into space, never imagining that someone might actually receive them, never imagining that those innocent greetings might be the first crack in Earth's carefully maintained isolation. How long until they reach Earth? 3 hours at their current speed. And ma'am, they're not slowing down. They seem excited. The linguistic analysis suggests they think we've been waiting for them. Martinez opened her eyes and looked out at the city below, at the millions of humans going about their lives. They had narrowly avoided exposure to the collective, had convinced one alien civilization to leave them in peace. But the galaxy was vast, and humanity had been reaching out to it for decades, sending messages and signals and invitations without understanding the consequences. The quarantine beacon had worked once. It might work again, but every encounter risked spreading human ideas to civilizations that couldn't handle them. Every contact brought them closer to the day when the galaxy would have to deal with humanity one way or another. Send them the updated beacon message, Martinez ordered, the one with the simplified warning, and prepare a diplomatic package explaining why the Arecibo message should be disregarded. We need to convince them to leave. And if they don't, Martinez thought about the collective's subcommander Vrath, who had listened and left despite his curiosity. She thought about the foreigners, who had tried to integrate humanity and died in the attempt. She thought about the 17,000 years of peace that the collective had built, and how fragile that peace might be if humanity ever spread beyond their solar system. If they don't leave, she said quietly, we show them what we showed the collective. We remind them why the beacon exists, and we hope that they're wise enough to listen. The assistant nodded and left to carry out the orders. Martinez remained at her window, watching her chaotic, quarrelsome, impossible species go about their daily lives. They fought and loved and created and destroyed with equal passion. They contained multitudes of contradictions and somehow remained whole. They were everything the collective feared and the foreigners couldn't contain. And maybe, Martinez thought, that was exactly what the galaxy needed. Not now, not yet, but someday, when humanity had matured enough to share their chaos without destroying everything around them. Maybe they would be the catalyst that pushed the galaxy toward something new, something that balanced the collective's harmony with humanity's freedom, something that allowed for both stability and growth. But that day was not today. Today, the beacon would remain, the warning would stand, and humanity would stay behind their walls, preparing for a future when those walls could finally come down. If that day ever came at all. Subcommander Vrath walked the corridors of Central Command's orbital facility, his mind clear and his purpose focused. The evaluation had been successful. He barely remembered his encounter with Earth, just vague impressions of a quarantined world with primitive inhabitants. Nothing worth remembering, but sometimes, late at night when he was alone with his thoughts, Vrath found himself wondering about things that didn't quite make sense. Why had the collective built such extensive quarantine protocols? Why did 17,000 years of peace sometimes feel like stagnation? Why did he occasionally catch himself wanting to choose his own path rather than following consensus? These thoughts never lasted long. He would report them during his regular psychological evaluations, and the medical team would adjust his neural patterns slightly, maintaining the harmony that made him a productive member of the collective. It was efficient. It was optimal. It was exactly what he needed. And if some tiny part of him whispered that he was missing something, that there was a question he should be asking but couldn't quite remember, he dismissed it as a minor glitch in his consciousness. Nothing important. Nothing that would change the fundamental structure of his existence. Nothing worth questioning at all. In the end, the beacon stood. The galaxy remained divided, and two incompatible ways of being continued on their separate paths, each convinced they had made the right choice, each carrying scars from their brief encounter that they would never fully understand. The humans stayed behind their walls, chaotic and free. The collective maintained its harmony, stable and eternal, and the distance between them remained a gulf too wide to bridge safely, too dangerous to ignore entirely. It was not a perfect solution, but in a galaxy full of impossible choices and competing truths, it was perhaps the best that anyone could have hoped for. The quarantine would remain, for everyone's sake. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, other beacons waited. Other warnings stood. Other impossible species lived behind walls of their own making, too dangerous to encounter, too precious to destroy. The galaxy was larger than anyone wanted to admit, and lonelier and stranger. And somewhere on Earth, humanity continued doing what it had always done, arguing, growing, changing, preparing for a future it couldn't predict and wouldn't accept if it could. The beacon had done its job. It would continue to do its job, perhaps for another 42,000 years, perhaps forever. But beacons, like walls, only work if people respect them. And in a galaxy full of curious species driven by the same urge to explore and understand that drove humanity itself, that respect could never be guaranteed. The story wasn't over. It was only paused, waiting for the moment when someone, somewhere, would ignore the warning one time too many. And then, for better or worse, the galaxy would finally have to answer the question, what do you do with a species that can't be conquered, can't be contained, and refuses to stay quietly behind their walls? The universe waited for that answer, and so did humanity. Behind their beacon, growing stronger, stranger, and more impossible with each passing year, the quarantine had bought time. But time eventually runs out for everyone, even for walls, even for beacons, even for warnings that no one wants to hear. The question wasn't whether the quarantine would end. It was simply when and what would happen after.